Hello, welcome. This is the Resilient Rooster, and today I'm gonna be giving 5 tips on how you can improve as a duelist. This will be mostly for like casual duelists, but if you want to try to improve, then these tips are gonna be for you. You might not be a pro overnight, but it'll give you some guidelines on what you need to look for and what to work on. So let's get started. Tip number 1, deck building. This is probably the most generic reasons I can give, but it's probably the most important. You can't win a deck with magical hats and spellbinding circle unless that's part of your win condition, which goes to the first part of this deck building. Whenever you're making a deck, you need to find a clear win condition. It could be summon your boss monsters to win, it could be chain burn your way to the win, it could be drawing Exodia, it could be final countdown. There's a lot of ways to win, and you have to find out one goal to try to achieve each duel. Once you know that your win condition, the next question is how consistent can you pull it off? Can you do it turn 1, turn 2? It all takes a matter of time, but the faster it is, the better it is. And once you figure that out, can your deck go first or second? And this is a big thing for most decks. If your deck can't go second well, then you have to try to revise it and edit until you can go second. So for example, Shadal Dino is basically one of the most, competitive decks out there. And their win condition is basically try to summon the ultimate conductor, and there's a lot of ways to summon it. You can summon it by just drawing it, or you can summon it by using the big evolution pill. But basically what Oviraptor does, it could send the overtext to get the big evolution pill. Armageddon Knight can also do the same thing. And then also the Shadal cards, they basically can send the overtext to get the big evolution pill. They all do one function, and that's why this deck basically works, because their win condition, ultimate conductor, and if they draw it, they have an out, right? So that's my tip for deck building. The next tip is shuffling. Shuffling is probably an underrated skill in Yu-Gi-Oh, but I feel that good players, they know how to shuffle well. That way they won't break in the next few games. And whenever you go to like locals or regionals, each person has their like own shuffling technique. You can probably view some of them and just, see if you like their technique or if you don't, right? It all just depends on the person, their perspective, their opinions. But I feel like you should shuffle every game. If you don't, then the chance of you breaking is going to just increase, because if you finish a game, most of the cards are usually together, and you don't want to draw, everything that you just used during your last turn. When you finish a match, meaning that you finished all 3 games or 2 games or whatever games it took, you should probably sort out all your cards before the next game. That way you don't need to waste time. One of the problems I had like at my regionals the other time, I didn't shuffle because I was in a rush. It was after lunch, and after lunch I didn't have the time before to shuffle my deck. So when I played my next opponent, I basically just bricked, and that was the first time I bricked like through that whole day. So I got caught salty, but that's basically some things that you have to remember. It's like the smallest details, it could change like the matter of like a win or a loss. And I felt that if I did shuffle that game, I may have a chance of winning. Tip number 3, body language. This is probably one of the harder things to master, but if you try to improve each time, maybe it'll come naturally. For the most part, whenever we play any kind of duel, we usually look at the first 5 cards in our hand and just think of the combos. But if you want to try to be like a little bit step further, you could try to, while you draw your 5 cards, you can try to look at your opponent and see if there's any expression on their body language. If you're going first and they're going second, like, do they seem agitated because they don't have a hand trap? Stuff like that, And also, like, whenever you're going off, do they basically have their cards on the table, in their hand, or what, right? This could also mean a lot of things. Some people just, lay their cards on the table. But for the most part, if they don't have their cards on the table, it usually means that they don't have a hand trap. And most times when people have hand traps, they usually have their hands closer to the table. And it's just, little stuff like that where you can just try to see if you can play around it. For the most part, most of these things that I might say might not be the same for each individual, but the more you practice with this, I guess the more you can look into the situation. Tip number 4 is probably knowing like the game well. And this is kind of like a harder one for most people, since whenever you buy like a structure deck, you usually get like a rule book, right? But no one really reads the rule book. The rule book gets longer each format, so basically it's a longer and longer to read. But for the most part, there's some cool things that, you can see from the rule books that most, beginners don't know. Some of the things is like the chain links, right? Chain links, they usually resolve backwards. So like if you have a chain from 5 chains, then chain number 5 will resolve, and then you go backward 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And remembering to control the chain links is important because sometimes you can play around like Solomon Strike or other cards, and it's just a good way just to play around in general. Then the next one is turn player, like the term for it. And that basically means that whoever turn it is, they basically have the choice on what to do first. Opponent can't interact unless they do something first. So for example, like opponent has an Omega, they can't chain to banish a card from your hand unless you do something first. The next one is like the damage step. Damage step is basically one of the trickiest things for beginners. The only thing that can activate during damage step is like basically anything that can change attack modifiers or counter trap cards. So for example, if my opponent has an electromagnetic turtle in the graveyard, but they didn't activate it during the damage step, or like if they didn't activate it during the battle, and you go to the damage step, they can't just banish the electromagnetic turtle and stop the battle phase. You can just declare damage step, and if they didn't say anything, then they can't chain anything, and you basically can possibly win since they didn't use the electromagnetic turtle. And then the last thing is like vocabulary. Yu-Gi-Oh is kind of sort of tricky, but there's words like if and when. If usually doesn't miss timing, and when can miss timing if used the wrong way. The last thing is punctuation, which is some text like Pot of Desires has a semicolon. It basically says banish 10 cards face down, semicolon, and then draw 2 cards. So whenever you see a semicolon, it basically means cost. Tip number 5, probably gonna be another generic reason, is just practice. You always gotta practice just to get better. But you should also practice like other decks too, because if you just practice your deck alone, you can't really ever learn anything new. And by playing other decks, you can try to sort of see like their strategy and what you need to do to stop their decks. And I think that's very important, because if you don't know what your opponent deck does, then you're usually at a disadvantage, right? Because you don't know like the combo strings that they can pull off in that deck. And if you just practice with other people, then usually you'll know what to do by the time that you get there. When you practice, you also tend to remember stuff. So for example, if your Skarm went to the graveyard and you want to try to get your search, your opponent can't really tell you, but you have to try to remember that during the end phase, because that's when the effect activates. Also, if you have like a Gem Knight Seraphonite on the field, you have to try to remember that you still have that extra normal summon. Some people that I see, they don't use that extra normal summon, and then that could cost them like the game, right? It's like these little things that can pay off if you just practice. So those are my 5 tips to improve as a duelist. If you enjoy it, please click the like button. If you want to see more Yu-Gi-Oh content, please click the subscribe button. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.